They called him Vlad the Impaler, but even that name fails to capture the darkness that surrounded him. Imagine a ruler so feared that entire armies retreated at the sight of his Forest of the Impaled. A man who dined among the dying, who ordered the turbans of ambassadors nailed to their own skulls, and who believed that the true language of power was terror, not diplomacy. Was he a patriot defending his land against the Ottoman Empire? Or a monster who took pleasure in human suffering? Some say his cruelty was propaganda invented by enemies. Others claim the horror was real, and far worse than any vampire legend that came after. Today we'll dive into the bloody reign of Vlad III of Wallachia, the man whose thirst for control inspired centuries of nightmares and gave birth to the myth of Dracula himself. But the real story is far more disturbing. You'll hear about the infamous Easter banquet, where nobles came to feast and ended up impaled, about the ambassadors whose faith became their death sentence, and about the campaign of psychological warfare that made even the mighty Sultan Mehmed II recoil in shock. Every act was a message, every execution a performance of power, and every victim a symbol crafted to spread fear across Europe. Was it madness or genius? And could that brutal logic still live on in the minds of some modern leaders? Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation about Vlad's death and what was found beside his unmarked grave will leave you speechless. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button right now. Your subscription tells YouTube that this kind of story deserves to be seen by more people. It helps the algorithm spread historical truths and mysteries to curious minds like yours. So don't just watch. Be part of this exploration into the darkest corners of history. And tell me in the comments, what surprises you most about Vlad the Impaler? The cruelty? The strategy? Or the possibility that, after all, he might not have been the villain history wanted us to believe? Vlad III was born in 1431 in the small and mysterious city of Sighișoara in the heart of Transylvania, a land of mist-covered mountains, dense forests, and castles rising like sentinels over the valleys. It was a time when Europe was plunged into chaos. Kingdoms rose and fell within years, and loyalty was worth less than a well-sharpened sword. Vlad was the second son of Vlad II Dracula, a knight of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian brotherhood founded to protect the continent from the Muslim expansion of the Ottoman Empire. The dragon symbol his father bore on his armor, an emblem of faith and power, would inspire a name that would echo through the centuries. Dracula, literally, the son of the dragon. From an early age, young Vlad was raised in an environment where betrayal, politics, and violence were part of daily life. His father alternated alliances between Hungary and the Ottomans, trying to preserve Wallachia's fragile independence, his homeland. Vlad grew up seeing that trust was a rare currency, and that in the politics of his time, survival depended more on fear than on friendship. In 1442, when he was only 11 years old, the boy's life changed forever. Sultan Murad Sekeg, suspicious of Vlad Dracula's loyalty, demanded a guarantor of his fidelity, and so Vlad and his brother Radu the Fair were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court in Adrianople. It was not merely a diplomatic act, it was a disguised sentence. If their father betrayed the Sultan, the sons would be executed. It was in this hostile and unpredictable environment that Vlad was forged, not as a prince but as a survivor. At the Sultan's court, he lived surrounded by luxury and danger. He silently observed the ceremonies, the punishments, the generals' debates. He witnessed public executions where traitors were impaled or beheaded before the crowds, and realized that terror held power. Vlad understood that fear could maintain order better than any written law. While his brother Radu adapted, becoming charming and even close to the future Sultan Mehmed II, Vlad nursed resentment and hatred. He saw his brother smile at the men who held them captive, and it consumed him. Every gesture, every punishment he witnessed seemed to carve into his mind the lesson that compassion was weakness. Over the years in exile, Vlad learned to master his rage and turn it into calculation. He studied strategy, governance, and military tactics, but above all, he learned to read fear in people's eyes. The boy who had been taken as a hostage would return years later as a man who believed that suffering could be a political tool. He remembered how the Ottomans used the example of pain to prevent rebellion, and swore that, when he held power, he would do the same, but with perfection. This dark period of his childhood was the psychological birth of the Impaler, the beginning of the transformation of the son of the dragon into a legend that still inspires both fear and fascination. It is said that during the long nights in the Ottoman palace, Vlad would look out the window toward the distant horizon and promise himself that one day he would rule his own destiny, and that all who had humiliated him would bow before his name. Many modern historians believe it was during this phase that he developed the profile of a cold, methodical, and unpredictable leader, molded by trauma and loss. And although history judges him for his cruelty, it is impossible to understand the monster without understanding the boy. Vlad's childhood was not just the beginning of a life marked by violence. It was the laboratory where the concept of power through terror was born. Because before he impaled his enemies, Vlad had been impaled by the very reality of his time, an era where mercy was synonymous with death. From here, the second part of his journey would begin, when the hostage would return to his homeland to claim the throne and write in blood the most feared chapter in the history of medieval Europe. The making of the monster began where childhood ends, in the wounded heart of a man who had already seen the worst of humanity before even becoming an adult. After years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, Vlad returned to Wallachia carrying not only the Turks' military and political knowledge, but also a mind reshaped by resentment and distrust. He had learned that pain molds more deeply than tenderness, and that compassion in a world driven by betrayal could cost one's life. While his brother Radu adapted easily to life at the Sultan's court, gaining favor and friendships, and, according to some rumors, even an intimate bond with Mehmed II himself, Vlad felt abandoned. The one who should have been his ally by blood had become the symbol of everything he despised. That silent rivalry grew like poison, corroding what little empathy remained in his heart. To Vlad, Radu was the living reminder of humiliation, the brother who surrendered while he vowed never to kneel. The pain of that family divide defined his relationship with the world. Vlad came to believe that loyalty was an illusion and that even love, when it existed, was merely another form of weakness. When he finally returned to his homeland, he found a Wallachia in ruins and a people divided between fear and despair. The elites who should have supported him, the boyars, had betrayed and murdered his father years before, and the Christian powers that had promised to protect the region, such as Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, were more concerned with preserving their own thrones than saving a small frontier prince. Vlad realized he was alone, and that isolation shaped him more profoundly than any battle. But there was something darker behind the warrior, a personal life marked by devastating losses. Little is known about his intimate relationships, but Byzantine sources and Hungarian chronicles describe him as a man of intense emotions, capable of deep love and destructive hatred. It is said that his first wife, whose name was lost to history, loved him with almost mystical devotion. Yet the cruel fate that always shadowed him spared not even that bond. During the Ottoman siege of Poenari Castle, surrounded and with no hope of escape, the young woman is said to have thrown herself from the top of the tower, choosing death over capture. They say that when Vlad saw her shattered body on the rocks, he murmured coldly, "Better to die pure than live a slave." That phrase, recorded by later chroniclers, sums up the mental state of a man who confused love with honor and pain with power. After that event, something within him broke for good. The man disappeared, and the legend took his place. Vlad began to see life as a perpetual battlefield where every emotion could be a trap. What might once have been tenderness turned into contempt. He no longer believed in love, only in domination. His future relationships, if they existed at all, were marked by distance, mistrust, and coldness. The prince who had once been the victim of politics now turned his own heart into a fortress. Curiously, some accounts from the period mention that even amid the violence, Vlad was capable of moments of melancholy. Hungarian chronicles tell of nights when he walked alone along the castle walls, gazing over the dark valley and murmuring words in Latin, perhaps prayers, perhaps curses. Witnesses said that when the moonlight fell upon his face, his eyes looked more sorrowful than cruel. It was as if the man he once was still fought in silence against the monster he had created within himself. But that struggle was futile. Vlad had already chosen the path of solitude. To him, trust was weakness and love a threat. No emotion could survive in the same heart that harbored so much resentment. From that point on, his life became an obsessive quest for control, power, and retribution. Those who knew him personally described him as someone who oscillated between charm and fury, refined courtesy and sudden violence. He could listen calmly to an ambassador and, moments later, order his execution without emotion. That unpredictability was partly tactical. Vlad knew that being feared was safer than being loved. But there was also a wounded, confused human side that sought in others' fear a way to ensure he would never be hurt again. The creation of the monster did not happen in a single day. It was the result of years of humiliation, loss, and solitude, a silent process in which every painful memory hardened into another layer of armor. The man who would emerge in the years to come would be more than a prince. He would be the architect of terror, someone who turned pain into method and suffering into art. From here begins the chapter in which the son of the dragon takes the throne and decides to rule with an iron fist, transforming fear into law and violence into political language. It was the beginning of an era the world would never forget. When Vlad III returned to Wallachia in 1456, the country was a field of political and moral ruins. The throne he inherited was not a symbol of glory, but a chair surrounded by knives. The boyars, the local nobility, had turned the principality into a game of power and betrayal, where loyalties could shift sides within days. The peasants lived in despair, paying heavy tribute to the Turks, and the economy was paralyzed by fear and corruption. It was a weary, divided land, ready to be reshaped by kindness or by terror. Vlad did not return to rule as a politician, but to avenge as a judge. He did not simply want to restore order, he wanted the name Dracula to become synonymous with absolute power. The prince had learned from the Turks that fear was more effective than diplomacy, and he decided to apply that lesson with brutal perfection. His first act of rule was both symbolic and bloody. That spring, he invited Wallachia's most powerful boyars to a grand Easter banquet in Târgoviște. It was the perfect moment to seal alliances and begin a new reign, or so the nobles believed. The tables were full, the wine flowed, the music echoed, and Vlad, with a calm smile, toasted to peace and prosperity. At the height of the feast, when all were drunk and distracted, the prince rose and solemnly began recalling the fate of his father and brother, slain by the same conspirators who now dined at his table. Then he gave the signal. His troops surrounded the hall. The elders were immediately impaled, and the younger nobles were forced to march for miles to Ponari Castle, where they would be enslaved to rebuild it, stone by stone. Vlad watched everything without averting his gaze. They say that as he saw the bodies trembling on the stakes, he murmured, "A man fears suffering more than death." It was the beginning of a new era, the birth of the politics of fear. What to many seemed madness was, to Vlad, logic. He believed that cruelty, when displayed publicly, created stability. The crimes and conspiracies that had destroyed the country would be eradicated not by justice but by the terror of facing the same fate. And indeed, it worked. Thefts declined, uprisings ceased, and even foreign ambassadors treaded carefully in his court. Vlad ruled with the precision of a general and the severity of an inquisitor. No offense was too small to escape punishment, and no traitor had the privilege of a quick death. Accounts from the time describe entire villages impaled, bodies arranged in geometric patterns visible from afar, and the prince himself dining among the dying as if at a royal banquet. It was terror elevated to the level of art. For Vlad, impalement was not merely punishment, it was communication. He knew that, in a world where strength was law, the image of suffering carried more weight than 1,000 decrees. Thus, he turned his realm into a macabre theatre, where each execution was a message to internal and external enemies alike. The people, though horrified, began to see in Vlad a kind of divine justice. Many peasants, long abused by noble greed, saw the executions as a cruel but necessary form of balance. Vlad had become, paradoxically, a hero of fear, the man who brought peace through terror. European diplomacy, however, saw something monstrous in him. Hungarian and Saxon ambassadors who visited Târgoviște described a charismatic, educated, even courteous ruler who spoke fluent Latin and discussed philosophy, while through the window impaled bodies swayed in the wind. That duality made him incomprehensible. Vlad did not see himself as a tyrant, but as a reformer. In his own words, a ruler who is not feared is not respected. And indeed, during his reign, the roads became safe. It was said that one could leave a golden goblet in the town square without anyone daring to touch it. Security was absolute, but the price was freedom. The people lived in silence, praying never to draw the prince's attention. Vlad had achieved what he wanted, to turn terror into stability. Yet this artificial peace was built over an abyss. The more power he gained, the further he drifted from anything human. The vengeance that had fueled him became an addiction. Each new act of cruelty reinforced his authority, but also isolated him from the world. Allies began to fear him, neighbors called him unpredictable, and even his own advisors avoided meeting his eyes. The man who had restored order was becoming a prisoner of his own reputation. And so, the Prince of Vengeance began to give way to the King of Terror. The ruler who would turn fear into a weapon more powerful than any army. From this point on, Vlad would cease to be merely a ruthless leader and become a true symbol of psychological domination, a master of manipulation through suffering. It was the beginning of the darkest and most strategic phase of his life. Behind the myth of the Impaler, there was a man driven by an ideal of order as rigid as his cruelty. Vlad III, the feared Prince of Wallachia, did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a reformer, someone who believed he was cleansing his land of corruption and sin. In his mind, terror was simply the price of justice. And that is what makes his figure so intriguing. The same man who impaled thieves and traitors was also described as disciplined, charismatic, and even fair, as long as no one challenged him. In Târgoviște, his capital, Vlad established harsh but clear laws. He banned theft, dishonesty, and the exploitation of the poor with a severity no ruler before him had ever dared to enforce. He believed corruption was a disease that rotted the soul of the kingdom, and that only fear could cure it. It is said that, in a symbolic gesture, he placed a golden goblet in the center of the main square, gleaming, valuable, within anyone's reach. The legend claims the goblet remained there throughout his reign, and no one ever dared to touch it. The people could live in peace as long as they followed the rules. It was a silent peace, but a real one. Vlad often said he preferred to rule a nation that was terrified and honest, rather than one that was free and corrupt. His logic was simple, almost mathematical. If everyone fears doing wrong, good will prevail. And, incredibly, there was some coherence in his philosophy. Wallachia, once unstable and ravaged, became one of the safest regions in Eastern Europe. Merchants traveled without escorts, the roads were free of thieves, and markets flourished under the shadow of fear. Vlad's presence imposed a kind of tense tranquility, as if even the wind whispered not to oppose him. Yet what many called justice, others saw as tyranny. Vlad believed his power came directly from God. He was deeply religious, faithful to the Orthodox Church, and saw himself as a divine instrument tasked with purifying Wallachia. He attended Mass, financed the construction of monasteries, and required his soldiers to pray before every battle. But his faith had a shadow. To him, sin deserved physical punishment, and forgiveness was a human weakness. He saw mercy as an error that nourished evil, and so the religious man and the executioner became one. A Franciscan monk who interviewed him in 1460 wrote a phrase that still echoes through history books. He believes himself to be the hand of God, and perhaps he is, if God has lost his mercy. That statement captures the paradox surrounding Vlad. He saw his reign as a moral crusade. He believed that by eliminating thieves, traitors, and infidels, he was fulfilling divine will. His executions, however terrible, were to him acts of spiritual purification. The problem was that, over time, this sense of justice blended with vanity and paranoia. Anyone who contradicted him was branded corrupt, heretic, or traitor, and the punishment was always exemplary. Still, there are accounts that Vlad could be charming when he wished. Foreign diplomats described him as a cultured man with a firm posture and commanding voice, yet polite speech and a magnetic gaze. He could discuss philosophy with monks and, moments later, order an execution with chilling calm. This duality both fascinated and terrified those who met him. Some said he was the perfect ruler for a cruel time. Others believed he had convinced himself he was more than a man, that he was divine judgment incarnate. He did not rule for pleasure, but for purpose. And he believed that if humanity lacked the courage to correct itself, he would do it with iron and blood. Even the priests who once supported him began to fear him. Many avoided speaking his name in sermons, and some fled the kingdom. The church's silence was a confession. No one dared condemn him, but neither could they call him a saint. Wallachia, under his command, was a mirror of Vlad's own soul, beautiful, disciplined, and terrifying. He had created a system where fear upheld peace and morality was measured by obedience. Perhaps that is why, to this day, his figure sparks so much debate. Was he a tyrant or a visionary? What is certain is that the man behind the monster truly believed he was saving his people, even if, to do so, he had to destroy what remained of his humanity. His reign was an extreme experiment in how far power and faith can intertwine, and this fusion of devotion and violence would become the prelude to the tragedy awaiting him in the years to come, when Vlad himself would taste the bitter flavor of imprisonment, loneliness, and betrayal. It was the beginning of the fall of the king, who loved order but forgot that even God in his justice knows how to forgive. The end of Vlad the Impaler was as dark as his entire life. After years of ruling through fear and confronting the powerful Ottoman Empire with a mixture of strategy and brutality, the Prince of Wallachia saw his reign collapse amid betrayal, isolation, and madness. In 1462, exhausted by endless military campaigns and the constant pressure of both internal and external enemies, Vlad was betrayed by his former Hungarian allies, the same ones who, in earlier times, had supported his struggle against the Turks. Captured, he was taken to Budapest, where he would spend 12 long years imprisoned. For a man accustomed to commanding, to deciding the fate of hundreds with a mere gesture, captivity was worse than death. They say his cell was damp, cold, and almost without light. There, the Prince of Fear became a prisoner of his own silence. At first, he tried to negotiate his release, sending letters to nobles and clergymen. But as the years passed, his mind began to sink into a dark labyrinth. Chronicles report that Vlad wrote confused messages on the walls and spent hours drawing human figures pierced by stakes, as if he were reliving in his imagination the empire of terror he had lost. In one of the most controversial letters that survived time, he wrote a phrase that perfectly defines his worldview. "I am not cruel. I am the mirror of the world. I show men what they would do if they had power." This statement is almost both a confession and a provocation. Vlad seemed to justify his atrocities by claiming that evil did not lie only within him, but within all men. He had merely made it visible. During his captivity, his guards described him as an unpredictable man. On some days he remained in absolute silence, praying and murmuring biblical verses. On others he erupted in fits of rage, shouting at the ghosts of enemies and calling for former allies. Many believed he had gone mad. Others said he feigned insanity to inspire fear even within prison. The fact remains that, when he was finally released, Vlad was no longer the same man. He was different. Colder, more restrained, with a gaze that, according to chroniclers, seemed to see beyond time. He returned briefly to Wallachia, but the world around him had changed. His former allies no longer trusted him, and the people viewed his return with suspicion and superstition. His reputation as a tyrant had become legend, and Vlad, in a way, was now a ghost of himself, a man who no longer knew how to live without the power of fear. Even so, fate granted him one last battle. In 1476, leading a small army against Ottoman forces, Vlad faced the enemy one final time. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Surrounded by Turkish soldiers, he fought fiercely to the end, refusing to retreat. Some say he died wielding his sword and laughing, as if defying fate itself. Others claim he was struck down by his own men, mistaken for an enemy amid the chaos. The end, however, is unquestionable. Vlad was decapitated, and his head sent as a trophy to Sultan Mehmed II, impaled on a stake, the very same fate he had imposed on thousands of his enemies. It was as if the universe, mercilessly, had closed the cycle of irony. His death brought no peace, On the contrary, it began the final transformation of his image into myth. Vlad's body was buried in an uncertain location. Some say at the Snagov monastery, others believe there was never a grave at all. When archaeologists opened the supposed tomb centuries later, it was empty, fueling the belief that Dracula never rested. Vlad's imprisonment and madness revealed that the man and the monster were inseparable. The power that defined him also destroyed him. He believed himself to be God's instrument, but in the end he became a living lesson that no man, no matter how feared, escapes the judgment of history. Isolation made him introspective, but it also trapped him within the labyrinth he had built himself. And even in death, he continued to haunt human imagination. The name of Vlad the Impaler did not vanish with his head. It spread across Europe as a symbol of fear and absolute power. Decades later, travelers and chroniclers still told stories of his reign with a mix of revulsion and admiration. Some called him a mad tyrant, others a patriotic hero. Perhaps he was a bit of both. The end of the Impaler also marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the man became legend. The image of Vlad transcended time, giving rise to myths that blended history and superstition. And while the prince's head rested on a stake, his shadow was already alive in the pages of human memory, laying the groundwork for the birth of a new name that would endure for centuries, Dracula. Thus ended the life of a man who sought to master fear, and was, in the end, immortalized by it. Centuries after his death, Vlad the Impaler was not forgotten. He evolved. From a feared prince to a literary character, from a cruel ruler to an eternal symbol of human power and madness. Time did not erase his story. It merely transformed it into something far more powerful than a king, a myth. When 19th century Europe began rediscovering its ghosts and medieval traditions, the name of Vlad rose again from the shadows. German, Hungarian, and Romanian chroniclers portrayed him as a man so bloodthirsty that even hell itself would fear to receive him. It was in this atmosphere of legends and ancestral fear that writer Bram Stoker, in 1897, used his name to create the character Count Dracula, the immortal vampire who drinks blood instead of spilling it. The irony is cruel. The real Vlad was more terrifying, precisely because he was human. He needed no fangs or immortality, only power and the belief that terror could build a nation. Fiction turned the political monster into a symbol of seduction and mystery, but reality was darker. The flesh and blood man truly believed that cruelty was a form of justice. In the 19th and 20th centuries, while the world romanticized the vampire, scholars began studying the real prince behind the legend. Modern historians and psychologists describe Vlad III as a brilliant strategist, but also a functional psychopath, someone with above-average intelligence, charisma, self-control, and a complete absence of empathy. His reign became a case study in the political use of fear. In recent documentaries, Romanian experts remain divided. For some, Vlad was a national hero, the first ruler to defy Ottoman domination and defend the frontiers of the future Romania. For others, he was a mass murderer, a man whose mind justified atrocities in the name of stability. One Romanian historian once summed up this contradiction in a phrase that still echoes today: "Without Vlad, Romania might not exist. But with him, humanity lost a part of itself." In the modern world, Vlad the Impaler has become a disturbing mirror. He is a symbol of absolute power and moral corruption. A reminder that true horror does not come from monsters or vampires, but from men who believe their ends justify any means. That is perhaps his most unsettling legacy, to show that the line between ruler and tyrant is thin, and that history tends to repeat its mistakes when it forgets the price of ambition. Today, tourism in Romania has turned Vlad into a brand. Castles associated with him, such as Bran and Poenari, receive millions of visitors each year. Hotels and products bearing the name Dracula multiply, blending reality and fantasy. And curiously, many Romanians see him as a symbol of national identity, not for the blood he spilled, but for the strength with which he defied empires. Still, there is something disturbing about how the world celebrates a man whose life was a catalogue of atrocities. Perhaps because, deep down, people are drawn to the figure of power, even when it is monstrous. Vlad the Impaler has become a reminder that humanity is capable of admiring what it should most fear. The myth of Dracula is merely the elegant disguise of a far harsher truth. the real monster was always human. And so we come to the end of the story of Thirth, the man who inspired centuries of terror, fascination, and contradiction. His life was a mixture of politics, fanaticism, and tragedy, a dark mirror of the human soul. The most disturbing thing is realizing that he was never just a villain. He was also a product of his time, a man who believed that order could be born from pain, that justice could come from fear. And that is precisely why his story remains alive. Because it speaks about us, about ambition, the pursuit of control, and the thin line between right and wrong. Today, Vlad the Impaler lives not in history books, but in every decision made by leaders who confuse power with entitlement and authority with impunity. His figure is a warning. When fear rules, humanity dies a little more. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history. And now I ask you, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your subscription is what tells YouTube that this content deserves to reach more people. It's what helps the algorithm understand that knowledge, even the darkest kind, must be shared. When you click like and leave a comment, you help this channel grow, to tell more stories that blend truth, mystery, and emotion. So tell me in the comments, what surprised you the most about Vlad the Impaler? His cruelty, his intelligence, or the fact that the real Dracula was more human than we ever imagined? And before you go, don't leave just yet. Watch the video now appearing on your screen, because it's even more intriguing and captivating than this one. I promise, if Vlad's story impressed you, the next one will leave you completely speechless.